I've always been particularly taken by that story from the book of Genesis, that story of Noah. And there's so much complexity in that story and difficulty in that story, and I have preached about that in previous sermons. Of course, there is the complexity and the difficulty with how to hold the fact that in the story, God chooses to wipe out humanity and save only a family, and that is something that I have addressed at another time. But there are also so many little nuggets in there, so many bits of metaphor and sort of figurative language that invite us to reflect on the human experience. And I think that this piece that Emily read this morning, where Noah opens a window and he sends forth a dove, and the dove flies out and returns, going to seek and then return, that there's something in there that holds a truth for human beings. And I think that there's something worth lifting and exploring in that. In a way, what Noah is doing when he opens the window is he's sending forth some signal, sending forth some feeler to see if there is some life, some possibility that he can find some respite and refuge from the storm that he and his family had experienced. And so he sends out that signal, and then it comes back and there's nothing. He sends out that signal, that feeler, and the signal comes back, there's nothing. He sends it out again, it comes back, and there's nothing. Finally, he sends it out another time, and what returns is the bird with a sprig of plant in its mouth, an olive branch in its mouth, and there is a signal in that there will be a possibility of respite, of refuge, of shelter, of land, that the waters are receding and that life is returning. And what I'm thinking about today with that story is that we often go through life and we send out signals to other people, and sometimes those signals return, and we hope that there's some kind of connection, some kind of respite or refuge that we might find in those relationships. And sometimes we find it, sometimes we don't. Sometimes we send out a signal, a feeler to another person, attempting to initiate a relationship or attempting to see if there's kind of a connection or a friendship that will be possible. And sometimes we receive an affirmative answer to that, and sometimes we don't. Oftentimes we have to send out that signal, that feeler again and again and again, and it has to return again and again and again with a signal that there is some possibility of life in that relationship that we might be able to hold and sustain with that other person, and that they are willing to do that as well. And it has to happen repeatedly before we discover that it is in that relationship that we're going to be able to find some shelter. That happens one-on-one, and it also happens in communities. And we Unitarian Universalists know about that because many of us come from communities where we sent forth those signals, where we sent forth those feelers, and what returned was not life or refuge or shelter. It was not a sense that that relationship could sustain a living connection, but was rather something that was void. And that might have been because of our entering into communities in which our beliefs did not align with theirs, and so we were turned away. Or entering into other communities or growing up in communities in which our doubts and our questions were not entertained or respected, and we felt turned away. And then it could also be because of our identities, who we are and our deepest selves. And we found that in those communities, those relationships, those connections were not sustaining. Padraig Otuma is a spiritual writer, and I've been particularly taken with his work recently. And one of his books is called In the Shelter. And what he talks about in that book is a sense of shelter, not simply in terms of physical shelter. Now, he does talk about that, and I don't want to make it sound as though I'm not attending to or caring about that reality, because there is a very real reality in which many people in our world cannot find physical shelter. I was just talking with Roger right before the service, and he was mentioning how there's just a story in the paper this week in which people, it was talking about how people are working full-time jobs and they're not able to afford rent. And so they're living out of their cars or living in other situations because they cannot afford a roof over their heads. So physical shelter is a real need. But the way that Padraig Otuma writes about shelter is especially compelling, in part because what he's talking about is the way in which we find shelter in our relationships with one another, the way in which we might find shelter in the language that we create together as a community or as a religious tradition. And he also reflects on the ways that sometimes the language that we create and hold together does not foster that sense of connection and shelter, that does not foster that sense of sustaining life. And one of the ways that he talks about that is he looks at the words that are in our religious traditions, scriptures, and finds ways that they exclude people, ways that they turn people away. And one of the things he was looking at in this book was really looking at the prohibitions and the abominations and all of the sort of restrictions that come up in the Hebrew scriptures. In particular, he was looking at this in the book of Genesis and in Leviticus. And Padraig Otuma was wondering about how can we hold forth an idea of a religious tradition as offering some sense of shelter and refuge for people at the same time that we acknowledge that there are these component parts of it that are far from hospitable to many people. And so what he decided to do is he decided to talk to one of his friends who he finds to be a really deep thinker in terms of religious tradition. And she comes from the Jewish tradition. And so as he was looking at, this part of religious tradition that is, a part of the Hebrew scriptures, he thought, I'm going to ask my friend what she thinks about this. And he asks, what do you make of these parts of the scripture that talk about, prohibition and abomination, or that talk about beliefs that many people who would ascribe to a more scientific understanding of the universe, such as the creation of the world in 7 days? What is it that you make of this? How do you approach these questions? And his friend offered a piece of wisdom and a way of thinking about this that I found both deeply whimsical and deeply wise. It has stuck with me since reading this part of his book. So he asked his friend this question, and she said, Padraig, here's the thing. We in the Jewish tradition, we don't ask questions about the first book of the Bible. We don't ask questions about the first chapter of the first book of the Bible. We don't ask questions about the first sentence of the first chapter of the first book of the Bible. We don't ask questions about the first word of the first sentence of the first chapter of the first book of the Bible. We ask questions about the first letter of the first word of the first sentence of the first book of the Bible. And then she went on to explain a bit about Midrashic commentary. And some of you may be familiar with Midrash and other people not so much. And Midrash is an often imaginative way in which we encounter a part of the scripture, a part of sacred writings, and then try to imagine what the author might have been intending or might have been thinking about it. And there is a whole, his friend wasn't making this up, there's a whole tradition of commentary on the first letter of the Bible. And that first letter, what has stumped many commentators is that it is not an A. In many in much of the tradition of Hebrew sacred writings, A is the first letter of those texts, and that is kind of considered an auspicious beginning. So that's why people begin with an A. So why is it not an A? And rather than an A, it's how we would translate from Hebrew. We would translate a B. And his friend thought about this for a very long time, and she was looking at the letter, and she said, I think I might know the answer. I think the answer might be in the shape of the letter, because the shape that a B takes in the Hebrew language looks an awful lot like a shelter. It looks like a home. And she says, isn't it wonderful that God might have chosen to begin the Bible with a sense of home? And if we can hold on to that sense of shelter or home, then whatever else we find later on, whether it aligns with our scientific understanding or, whether it's, whatever else it's telling us, as long as we can maintain that sense of home, of shelter, of hospitality that we are providing to ourselves and that we're providing to others, that's going to be what is important. That's going to be what's crucial in understanding how we choose to relate to our religious tradition and choose to relate to one another. It's interpreting the scripture through the lens of shelter and hospitality rather than getting stuck on other details that might end up excluding people. And I thought there was something very powerful in that, something very compelling in that. Now, we Unitarian Universalists have been on a bit of a journey these last couple of years because we have been deeply considering our own language. Many people came to Unitarian Universalism and encountered the 7 principles, which were created in 1985, and which sort of defined our religious tradition for many people. And many people who found it found some shelter and refuge in those principles. And as we have been considering that language and considering changing that language, there has been some real grief at potentially losing that language. And this summer, we have indeed voted. I was at the General Assembly just before I went on my sabbatical, and the vote took place, and we have indeed changed that language. The 7 principles are no longer what is in what's called Article 2 of the UUA bylaws. Instead, we're affirming 7 values, and if you're curious about what these are, you can turn to the back of your order of service because we have printed them there. What has struck me as being important in this change is actually less about the content of the language. I was somebody who felt that really whether we end up keeping the 7 principles or we end up changing to the values that we have now adopted and that are on the back of the order of service, either would be fine. And the reason I say that is because it's for a couple of reasons, but one of them is that I think about Unitarian Universalism. It's a religious tradition that's 500 years old. The language around what is its core values or principles or beliefs has changed again and again and again. And Emily did a wonderful course back in the fall about sort of the changing language in our religious tradition and the many times. Do you remember how many times it would be impossible to tell how many times the language has changed, because you'd be looking at different subgroups in Unitarian Universalism in different parts of the world. It would be very, very difficult to tell. But even with those changes that have taken place in Unitarian Universalism, what I find to be really important is less the content that we've come up with and more the spirit in which we choose to approach one another. Are we using our language? Are we using our communities in ways that continue to offer hospitality and shelter to one another? Are we using our language and using our interactions with one another in order to foster that sense of refuge and that sense of life that has been offered through Unitarian Universalism to so many people who have come, especially from religious traditions in which they encountered exclusion in the past? I think that if we're able to hold on to that sense of hospitality and shelter in our interactions with one another, if we're able to continue to approach each other with kindness and open-heartedness and generosity, then the specific language doesn't matter as much. There's still some hard feelings. It was a difficult debate that occurred on the General Assembly floor, and some people left feeling very much unheard in the debate that occurred around the change in the language. I'd like us to consider, how can we enter more deeply into relationship with one another at the same time that we disagree with each other, and continue to hold on to that open-heartedness and generosity in a way that offers shelter? Because when we're able to do that, then I think that we are holding forth to our principles and our values, however it is that we choose to articulate them in our language. I absolutely love this modern reading that Emily offered today, and I'd like to close by offering that poem once again. It's by Albert Garcia. She says, "Here, take this palmful of raspberries as my gift. It isn't much, but we've often said our needs are simple. Some quiet time alone on the patio in the cool morning, coffee, a few words over the newspaper. I've rinsed these berries so that you can tumble them right into your cereal. 1 minute on the vine, the next in your bowl, my hand to your mouth. Let's say my words were as simply sweet as these berries, chosen as carefully, plucked and held, then delivered as perfect morsels of meaning. not what you hear, which is never what I mean to say. Will you take these words? Will you feel their weight on your tongue? Will you taste their tang as they slide into you, small, bright, and honest? This is the gift that I have to give. What I'm taking away from this poem is this simple gift of language, this language that offers to one another a deeper sense of shelter, of refuge, of life, offering that up in its simple sweetness and brightness, and then being willing to accept from that space of open-heartedness those words from one another. When we are able to do that, our relationships provide to one another that sense of shelter and safety that our souls have been seeking all this time.